Well, joining us now is former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy to continue the conversation on the G7. Lloyd, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Nice to be here.
Now, you are a veteran of these gatherings, and when you look at the competing interests that the Prime Minister had to navigate in Kananaskis, what do you make of Mark Carney's performance chairing his first G7 conference?
Well, I think he did the best under the circumstances, but I think it's time we took a pretty careful look at the G7 itself. I agree with Peter Harder that the G7 is really, I think, diminishing in both influence and in relevance. Let's be honest about it. We can talk about stuff G7 approaching, quote, the Kananaskis charter on what wood fires. Well, what we don't have is a charter saying, what do we do about the use of fossil fuels, which is the reason why we have worldwide outbreaks of these kind of forest fires. The same thing on Ukraine. President Zelensky was specifically invited to find a forum in which the United States president would be part of a collaborative group. And of course, it seems Donald Trump can't stay any more than 24 hours at any meeting in Canada. And all of a sudden, the Ukraine commitment, which is absolutely essential, the G7 was basically neutered on this. I think Mr. Carney, was dealt a pretty weak deck to begin with, because anything that Donald Trump is involved in is clearly something that has all the potential of risk and damage, and of course it has. So I think I really prefer us to be realistic and honest about appraisal and realize why the G7 seems to be prestigious is increasingly losing its effectiveness in actually initiating actions to solve world problems in a collaborative way.
Okay, let me jump in there. You say it decreasing in its capacity, but is that a function of this one president? Because we know that Donald Trump does not like multilateral efforts. Is that because of this one president, or do you think this is basically the dying days of an organization that just marked its 50th gathering here in Canada?
There's an old saying about the old order is dying, the new one hasn't been born. I think we're seeing a lot of the disappearance or really shakedown of institutions that we've honored and that we felt useful. But it's time to start thinking of some new ones. And how do we redesign our system to take into account of? Donald Trump is not going away. He's around for another 3 years. Are we going to have another 3 years of G7s and the kind of parody that goes on in these things? Or are we going to, stand up and take some stands on this? I think, for example, the G7 has made a mistake in the past of not adding some new members from the global south, Korea, Brazil, Australia, who were democratic societies and could actually bring to the table a different kind of a voice. And I think the only way to deal with Mr. Trump is to simply drown him out and have enough countries who have the will and the resources to provide alternatives to U.S. policy. Otherwise, we're going to be living in a world in which the kind of mendacity of Donald Trump is going to be triumphant.
You say a different voice, and I'm going to move on from Donald Trump here, because there was several voices heard, as we heard from Senator Harder. Day two oftentimes is dedicated to inviting leaders not part of the G7 list of countries, and one of the leaders invited this year was, of course, the Prime Minister of India. And I'm going to read to you here a bit of the joint statement that was released after the bilateral meeting. It just wrapped up in this last half hour between the Prime Minister of Canada and India. The statement says, Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Modi reaffirmed the importance of Canada-India ties based upon mutual respect, the rule of law, and a commitment to the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The leaders agreed to designate new high commissioners with a view to returning to regular services to citizens and businesses in both countries. Again, that was the joint statement just issued in the last half hour or so, Mr. Axworthy. But the Prime Minister was criticized for inviting the Prime Minister of India to Alberta. Did Canada lose any moral high ground by including Narendra Modi in this meeting?
Well, it lost it with the Sikh community, who feel very strongly about the what they see as the persecution of Mr. Modi's government. But I agree the importance of having a meeting with them and trying to reestablish some contact. I think that makes good sense. But the communique, once again, didn't deal with the real issues. The real issues are that there's a fundamental question about the Khalistan movement, who are considered to be terrorists in India and considered to be sort of logical and important members of the Canadian identity. Uh, I think it's time to be just a little bit more open and left bafflegab. But I think it's another example, Michael. I'm not trying to be harsh, but I'm glad that they had the meeting, and I'm glad that there is an effort to start putting in place some proper connections. But to claim that this is sort of coming to grips with the fundamental issues between Canada and India remains to be seen.
Hmm. You mentioned the Sikh community here, and I do want to point out the fact that this was not agreed to, but in terms of the Indian Prime Minister saying this. But as I go on to the statement, it says Mark Carney did raise priorities on the G7 agenda, including transnational crime and repression, security, and rules-based order. I'm wondering if that is some way to address some of the criticisms that have been lodged at the Prime Minister for inviting Prime Minister Modi.
But here's an angle, Michael. Uh, we had an election in which the Canadian public made very clear they want a more independent strategy in defense and trade and other things. We hear from Mr. Trump on the way back to Washington that Canada wants to join this Golden Dome. Golden Doom is actually a better word. And it's only going to cost us a mere 71 billion. I think Mr. Carney has to clear the air on this issue. Are we actually negotiating to join this kind of fantasy proposal of Mr. Trump, which is going to cost billions of dollars, suck money away from the real defense security issues we have, and actually probably generate a new kind of arms race in space? I think that I think Canadians, and I think Parliament in particular, is owed that kind of explanation.
Owed an explanation, although, I have to say, I was thinking about you today when we were hearing from Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, because we did hear from her during this meeting, essentially confirming what has been talked about here in Ottawa, speculated, if you will, that in a matter of days, Canada will sign an agreement that deepens military and security ties with Europe. You and I have talked in the past. You've expressed concern about Canada being too close to the U.S., particularly in light of comments made by Donald Trump about annexation. What do you think of this move by the Carney government to get to essentially reinvigorate the alliance with Europe?
I think it's a good one, but how do you fit that commitment with the kind of commitment that seems to be alive or at least under discussion to entangle ourselves even more deeply with the U.S. military systems? I mean, is it simply a contradiction, or is Mr. Trump not telling the truth? Well, I mean, that's quite a possibility. He's a well-known liar. But I think we shouldn't be having these discussions so much behind the closed doors. I think it's time that Parliament be brought into the discussion, the Canadians be brought into the discussion. And I think moving with Europe, but again, I think there are things that we have to do more independently ourselves. I think the Arctic is an area where Canada has to take special responsibility and work with Denmark and Greenland and the other the Nordic countries to make sure it doesn't become a playground for the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans. These are things that I think we have to toughen up in terms of what we're prepared to do. And diplomatic language doesn't always have to be simply a form of flattery or occasion. I think Canadian people gave Mr. Carney a very strong mandate to take a very strong independent line for Canada.
Given this mandate, but and I hear what you're saying about the public statements and the joint statements that we're getting out of the G7. But you've, as I said, you've been a part of these meetings. You've been a part of several international meetings, and obviously there are closed-door conversations. And if Canada is looking to build relationships beyond the United States, which we've seen movements towards that, how important was the FaceTime at Kananaskis? I appreciate what you're saying about the G7 perhaps needing to have more teeth, but behind closed doors, do you think something was accomplished there? How important are those face-to-face meetings for the Prime Minister?
Well, they potentially are important. I mean, that's a place where you establish good relationships, where you get to know each other and you can share ideas and thoughts about it. And I hope that's what happened. We certainly need to do that. But the soup will be in the telling and the eating. Does this result in Canada taking more independent status? Are we actually, what kind of procurement are we going to do? Are we going to sort of cancel the F-35? Are we going to buy a Swedish plane? Are we going to stop using the black boxes in our destroyers and ships and planes that come to us from the United States? People are really looking for a different signal. And right now, I have to say that it's become increasingly more muted. And maybe that's just good politics, but sometimes good politics is not strong politics. Let me say, for example, if I have one disappointment, Michael, about this, it's about Ukraine. President Zelensky was invited specifically so that the G7 could establish a much stronger set of supports, sanctions, identification of ghost ships, and even the Canadian idea that was at the G7 last year to release frozen assets, Russian assets that are frozen, in order to get Ukraine to help pay for the damage and the destruction that's going on. This wasn't on the agenda at this meeting. It was taken off because some Europeans didn't like it, the Americans didn't like it. And so here was something that was a very significant move at the last G7, should have been followed up here, but it wasn't even talked about.
As I listen to you speak, Mr. Axworthy, I wonder how final this judgment is, because, and I touched upon it before, but maybe we can dig in a bit deeper, because, President Trump is currently the U.S. president. This will not always be the case. Is it because you believe essentially the United States, this withdrawal or this hesitancy that we're seeing from the Trump administration will be a permanent marker of our relationship with the U.S. going forward?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's a fundamental belief or trust in the relationship with the U.S. has been broken. Over half of of Americans voted for Donald Trump, and there's still his approval ratings with the right wing. He is still, and he will be president. And after whom comes J.D. Vance, who would be, a kind of a mini-me Donald Trump. That particular political movements in the United States, which is taking over their institutions, their law systems, their universities, the State Department, withdrawing from any commitments, those are hard to repair. I mean, the damage that's happening right today in Africa on health issues for children and women, vulnerable people, is immense. And I think the same thing, the kind of work I do, Michael, on refugees, the withdrawal of any support for refugees is again having a horrible sort of impact upon people. If the G7 really had a kind of a little sharp end to the spear, it should have been addressing these issues, but they weren't, because those are not issues that would keep Mr. Trump happy. And so we had some good conversations. That's a plus. I think that there's been some releases, but no strong issues on the tough issues, such as how do we make sure that Ukraine is not overwhelmed by the Russian aggression? That, to me, is an issue at the center of our international politics right now.
Forgive me for jumping in, but I have about a minute left with you, Mr. Axworthy. The next G7 is scheduled for France next year. Should Canada participate in that?
I think what Canada should do is be putting some proposals out as we start negotiating, saying how do we make this system work? I mean, as Peter Harder said, it's based upon what we consider a common ethos. Well, that common ethos is not shared by Mr. Trump. So how do you cope with that? That's a serious issue. In order to revive and revitalize the G7 and give it new life, I think we have to do more than just sort of say, okay, it's happening a year from now. Let's repeat the same old sort of minuet again. I think there's an opportunity for Canada to show some leadership here.
Lloyd Axworthy, always appreciate the time, especially your thoughts as the G7 wraps up meeting in Kananaskis. You take care.